Last night I mentioned to you that the respected Mideast journalist Robert Fisk has written an article in the Independent newspaper in the UK called The Demise of the Dollar. He's talking about the US dollar. Now, we already know that it's sliding compared to the Aussie here in Australia. It's now up at the ridiculously high level of 89 cents. The Australian dollar is now at 89 cents US. I mean, crikey, we'll have parity by the end of the year, which would be remarkable in itself. But in the article, Robert Fisk has written that one of the most profound financial changes in recent Middle East history is occurring. Gulf Arabs are planning, along with China, Russia, Japan and France, to end dealing in dollars for oil, moving to what's described as a basket of currencies, including the Japanese yen, the Chinese yuan, the euro, gold, and what they describe as a unified currency planned for nations in the Gulf Cooperation Council states, the oil-producing states mostly, including Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait and Qatar. These meetings up until this point have been described by Robert Fisk as secret, that they've been held by finance ministers and central bank governors in Russia, China, Japan and Brazil to work out a scheme which will mean that oil will no longer be priced in US dollars. What does this mean? Well, I've asked my completely unpaid financial consultant from Leithner and Associates, Chris Leithner, to do a bit of digging around and come back in and tell me. Chris, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
I think it's probably worthwhile starting on a bit of a history lesson, first of all. How was it that it came about that the US dollar was the currency that was used to trade securely internationally since World War II?
Right. In 1944, towards the end of the war, at a cute little town in New England in America called Bretton Woods, the victorious powers, which was basically the United States and to a limited extent the UK, decided on a range of things. Amongst other things, they created the International Monetary Fund, they created the World Bank, and they basically decided that the US dollar would be what's called a reserve currency, which gives it basically a privileged status for all manner of things, including world trade. Critical difference between...
So it was an agreement between the two surviving industrial powers of World War II, the dominant powers, UK and US.
An agreement between 30-something powers, of which far and away the most important one was the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, etc., Latin American republics, and so on. But for all intents and purposes, America agreed with itself, with the acquiescence of the UK, that the US dollar would henceforth be the biggest kid on the block. Critical point about the US dollar is that from 1944 began a process which ended in 1971, that it became what's called a fiat currency, F-I-A-T, which is about as reliable as the vehicle which comes to mind. In the good
what does that mean? What is a fiat currency?
A fiat currency is backed by nothing apart from, quote, the good faith and credit of a particular government, which should bring a smile to our face, if not ribald laughter. In other words, in the good old days, namely in the 19th century, the pound in your pocket was literally backed by gold. The dollar in your pocket, with the exception of the American Civil War, was backed by basically something that people from time immemorial, from the beginnings of human history, had attributed a definite value to, namely to gold, and in the United States to a limited extent to silver. So in other words, the purpose of a bank, amongst other things, if you had a dollar in your pocket, you could exchange it for a certain amount of gold, and vice versa. But today, you can exchange your dollar for, 5 20-cent pieces, for 10 10-cent pieces, but the value, in fact, is conjured out of thin air.
It doesn't have inherent value anymore.
Precisely right.
Okay, now the Bretton Woods Agreement, designed to do what? What came out of it? A couple of major financial structures came out of it, didn't they?
The International Monetary Fund, which is, if you like, simplifying drastically, an organization of developed countries, now particularly Europe and the United States, but China is becoming much more significant, to regulate financial flows and the like. And the World Bank, which, again, simplifying drastically, is to help to push up what used to be called the third world, the developing world, to increase standards of living, places like Africa, Asia, and so on.
So it was the Bretton Woods Agreement after World War II which set up the architecture for the modern international finance system.
In a word, yes.
For the globalised world, as it were.
Basically, that's right.
All right. Now, that stage, America was the big trading partner, the industrial giant, the muscle of the global economy.
That's right. It was basically the last person left standing in a capitalist sense after the Second World War. Obviously, the Soviet Union bulked very large, but not in a sense that would have much to do with international trade flow. So, in effect, America could write the rules, but it wrote the rules with a fair bit of agreement from countries like the UK, Australia, Canada, and so on. Now, the critical point with this sort of a fiat currency is that unlike gold, which is relatively difficult to dig up out of the ground, if you want to increase the money supply in a gold standard, you have to hire someone to go and dig it out of the ground. If currency is not backed by gold, increasing the money supply is incredibly easy. You simply turn on the printing press or its modern electronic equivalent. And the trouble that's occurred is that America's privilege as that reserve currency, or the US dollar's privileged position as that reserve currency, has been vastly abused. That in effect they've run the printing presses at a vastly increasing scale over the years, and certainly since the middle of 2007, the amount of bond issuances just this week as we speak, $162 billion dollars US of bonds are being issued. In other words, the volumes are vastly greater than we've ever seen before. Other countries, notably China, to some extent Japan, Russia, are looking at this and saying, the more dollars that there exist,
the less value they have.
The lower the value that they have.
Yep.
Is there something we can do possibly to protect ourselves against the steadily eroding value in international markets of the US dollar? And the article by Robert Fisk is one of the results. Now, there have been several moves on this over the years, but it's interesting, though, within a month or two of Saddam Hussein's announcement that henceforth Iraq's oil was going to be denominated in something other than U.S. dollars.
The euro, I think he was talking about.
He was talking about the euro, and suddenly he has, the skies of Iraq are filled with American and British jets and so on. When the Iranians became very serious.
That's right. It was about a couple of months after he announced he would be selling oil in euro, not U.S. dollars. Weapons of mass destruction raison d'etre for invading Iraq occurred.
Indeed, and about 3, 4, 5 years ago, Iran began to make similar sorts of noises, and the drumbeats of war from Washington began to reverberate. Why would this be? In an extreme case, if oil is denominated in a currency other than the U.S. dollar, say in euros, or a basket of currencies that you described, in an extreme case, the demand in international markets for U.S. dollars falls off. The value of it slides at an ever-accelerating pace. And how does America finance itself? Well, it has to issue more and more dollars. How does it persuade people to hold them? By increasing rates of interest and so on. So in an extreme case, that would be a possible result. That's to say the slide of the US dollar accelerates. But there's... Go ahead.
Well, Chris, I was going to say, I want to wind back a bit. So since the beginning of this year, actually, there has been talk amongst many nations of having a new global reserve currency. They've been quite open about it.
Yes.
But this one is unusual, a little bit unusual, and you've had a look at Robert Fisk's argument. This one's unusual because it's specifically Arab oil states together with China, Russia.
And indeed, on the sidelines are India, Brazil, and major, if you like, up-and-coming...
new nations, if you like, emerging nations, I guess.
Precisely right.
Emerging industrialised nations.
Correct, yes.
All right, now, that would appear to change the balance of power, at least economically.
Potentially, that's exactly right. Now, is it the case that...
Just come closer to the microphone, if you would, please, Chris.
Is it the case that economic developments over the past, or financial development since 2007, has that hastened America's relative decline, or has it revealed what was a decline that existed all along, that the net debt of the U.S. is on the order of $15 trillion, add to that the very stimulus packages, that virtually doubles it. People are looking at this and saying, goodness me, America's financial condition is worsening and worsening at an accelerating pace. We other countries, need to do something about this in order to adjust to its weakening state.
So how much debt does the United States have at the moment?
What's called on-balance sheet debt, if you look at its assets and liabilities and so on. As we speak, the national debt, in other words, that's built up since 1789, on the order of roughly $13 trillion. Add to that the various stimulus packages in various forms, bank guarantees, bailouts, GM bailouts, etc. Add another crudely $12 trillion to that. The real difficulty, though, is what's called their off-balance sheet liabilities. That's to say Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, pharmaceuticals expenditures that they'll have to pay in future decades to people as they age. Estimates there vary, but the bidding begins at about $70 trillion. In other words, America basically, the Federal Reserve has analysed this, and they come with very understated conclusions, but they do not disagree with the conclusion that America has dug itself into a debt pit from which it cannot extricate itself.
So Marx was right. Capitalism will destroy itself.
No, Marx was dead set wrong, of course. The communism fails. What we've talked about, this fiat currency, is imposed by governments. It's not a creature of the free market. A gold standard was when individuals are left to decide what is something that has value amongst us. Going back to the time of the Egyptians, free people, of which there haven't existed that often in human history, I'll allow, free people come up with gold. Governments hate gold because governments cannot readily increase the money supply, and it's quite significant. The heyday of the gold standard, when Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, what was that, roughly 1815, till the time of the outbreak of the First World War, basically a century of peace considered between world powers, European powers and America. The U.S. Civil War was the major exception. Why was that? Because under a gold standard, governments cannot ransack the population. They cannot wage war. Under a fiat currency, which is why the gold standard was abandoned during the First World War, that's the only way by which governments can finance warlike expenditure. So it seems to me it demonstrates the futility of socialism to say, look, a fiat currency, by definition, is going to fail, and we're seeing that in slow motion here. Now, this could take years, it could indeed take decades, but it simply doesn't work because underlying it is nothing. It has no inherent value.
Robert Fisk, in his article, argues essentially that nothing can really be locked in for at least sort of nearly a decade in terms of trading in something other than US dollars.
Well, that's right. And indeed, the model which his article mentions, this basket of currencies, in effect, that's quite unstable too, because this basket will consist in what are the currencies, what percentage will the Chinese currency be, what percentage will the Russian be, and there's going to be incessant jockeying about that. So my guess would be that basket of currencies isn't going to work either. I know with great interest over the past several years, the Russians have spoken in quite positive terms about a gold standard. And lo and behold, because they're a major producer of gold, that's they're talking their book, as it were. The Chinese have
to their advantage, yep. Mm-hmm.
To their advantage. The Chinese too have said, gee, perhaps something along the lines of a gold standard is interesting. A fellow, Robert Mundell, who won a Nobel Prize roughly 10 years ago, he shocked people. People were literally jaw-dropping stuff because in his Nobel speech he said, gee, a gold standard has some very positive attributes, and we're worse off without something that at least has gold as a component. So lurking in the background, governments hate it because gold limits governments' power. Governments can't do the sorts of things that they become accustomed to doing over the past, 50, 60 years since the
printing money.
Printing money at willy-nilly ad nauseum. They simply can't do that. So what we see at the moment is kind of this unstable situation. Is the American dollar on its way out? Likely, but it could well take years or even decades. What will replace it? Very much up in the air. That basket that Fisk's article mentions, gee, is that a solution? My guess is that it isn't, for the simple reason that governments couldn't agree amongst themselves what would be the currencies, what would be the relevant percentages, and so on. So the stability imposed by America being the preeminent economic power after the Second World War just isn't there. We haven't had an honest currency since then. For that reason, we haven't had honest governments since then. And so I dare say that there'll be an element of turbulence with which we'll have to live, for better or for worse, for years to come.
I really appreciate you coming in. Thank you very much, Chris Leithner, once again.
Great pleasure.
Chris Leithner is with Leithner and Associates.